Imagine living in a world where your future, your very security, hinged on a single, massive payment from your family. Payment so significant it could bankrupt your loved ones, decide your worth, and dictate your entire life. How would it feel to know that your path, your power, and even your peace of mind were determined by how much silver, how many acres of land, or how many prized head of cattle your parents could gather for your wedding? Welcome to the year 1060, where for women, the dowry was not just a custom, it was often a cage. Number 6, her commodification and reduced marital choice. In the year 1060, the very air women breathed was thick with the silent understanding that marriage was not primarily about affection or shared dreams. Instead, it was an intricate tapestry woven from threads of land, lineage, and perhaps most prominently, hard-earned wealth. A young woman's worth, in the eyes of society and potential suitors, was often quantified, reduced to the sum total of the dowry her family could muster. This chilling reality meant that she was, in essence, a commodity in a vast, complex marketplace of alliances, her future negotiated with the cold precision of a merchant bartering for goods. Imagine a daughter coming of age in an Anglo-Saxon village, her heart perhaps yearning for a young man from a nearby farm, his smile bright, his laughter genuine. Yet her family, acutely aware of their social standing and economic future, would look beyond such tender considerations. Their gaze would be fixed on the prospects that a strategic marriage could bring: a merger of lands, an enhancement of status, a bolstering of connections that could last for generations. Dowry she could bring to this union was the currency of these negotiations, the glittering coin that opened doors to powerful families or sealed agreements that benefited her male relatives. Family was rich in land, then a significant parcel of that land, perhaps a thriving meadow or a small, productive manor, would be designated as her dowry. Their wealth lay in herds of shaggy cattle or stores of gleaming silver, then these precious assets would be carefully counted, their value meticulously assessed, all in preparation for the moment when her hand in marriage would be offered, complete with its substantial economic attachments. This constant valuation, this perpetual accounting of her inherent value, based on what she could bring, stripped a woman of her individual identity. She was not primarily a person with hopes, talents, or a unique spirit. She was a vessel for assets, a walking balance sheet. Her beauty might be admired, her gentle nature appreciated, but these attributes were often secondary to the material wealth she represented. Family with many daughters, especially if their fortunes were middling, faced a crushing burden. Daughter's marriage required a new dowry, a fresh depletion of resources that might otherwise be invested in the family's main holdings or reserved for the sons who would carry on the family name and hold the ancestral lands. The pressure was immense, leading to difficult choices. Perhaps the dowry for one daughter would be smaller, limiting her prospects to a less affluent suitor, someone with less land or a lower social standing. The other daughters might then be expected to make even greater sacrifices or to secure better matches to compensate for the perceived shortfall. It was a vicious cycle, trapping families and forcing them into pragmatic decisions that often overshadowed any consideration of personal happiness or compatibility. The impact on a woman's marital choice was profound and devastating. Options were not guided by her own desires, by genuine affection, or by a shared vision of a future built together. Instead, her fate was primarily determined by the size and nature of her dowry. A magnificent dowry, consisting of extensive lands or a substantial amount of silver, could propel her into a marriage with a powerful nobleman, a lord with vast holdings, or a wealthy merchant whose ships sailed the seas. This was often seen as a triumph for her family, a feather in their cap, securing their own position in the intricate social hierarchy. However, such a marriage came at a steep cost. It meant entering into a union that was, first and foremost, a political and economic alliance. Personal feelings, her aspirations, her very voice in the matter were often rendered irrelevant, drowned out by the clamor of negotiations over cattle, fields, and future alliances. She became a pawn in a larger game, her happiness secondary to the strategic advantage her marriage could bring. Conversely, a woman from a poorer family, or one whose dowry was considered meager, faced a stark and often heartbreaking reality. Choices were severely constrained, limited to men of lesser means, men who might not offer the security or social standing that she and her family desperately desired. She might be married off to a lesser noble, a hardworking but land-poor farmer, or even a tradesman, simply because her dowry, however small, was all that could be afforded. This was not a choice born of affection, but of necessity. It was a matter of survival, ensuring she had a husband and a place in society, no matter how humble. Potential for a loving, respectful partnership was often overshadowed by the raw, undeniable force of economic reality. Her hopes and dreams for a grand, romantic future, perhaps fueled by the tales of bards and minstrels, would slowly wither under the relentless pressure of a society that valued wealth above all else. She understood with a painful clarity that her worth was measured not by her character or her spirit, but by the tangible assets she brought to her marital bed. This commodification extended beyond the immediate marriage negotiations. It shaped her entire life within the marriage. If her dowry was substantial, she might command a certain level of respect, but it was often a respect tied to the assets she represented, not necessarily to her as an individual. Her husband might see her as a valuable acquisition, a means to expand his lands or solidify his power, rather than a partner. This dynamic could lead to a lack of genuine intimacy or emotional connection, as the marriage remained rooted in its initial transactional nature. The power dynamics were skewed from the start. A woman who had brought a significant dowry might find herself constantly reminded of its contribution, perhaps subtly or overtly, whenever disagreements arose or whenever her husband felt her actions did not align with the expectations tied to her economic value. Her voice might be heard, but only within the confines of her economic contribution. The reduction of a woman to an economic asset had profound psychological implications. It instilled within her a pervasive sense of being bought or sold, a feeling that her destiny was not her own. This feeling, while perhaps unspoken, could foster resentment, a sense of helplessness, and a profound lack of agency over her own life. She was trained from a young age to understand her role in this economic exchange, to accept that her future lay in the hands of her family and the men who sought her dowry. This societal conditioning, reinforced by generations of tradition and expectation, meant that rebellion was almost unthinkable, and personal desire was often stifled before it could even blossom. The silence of women in these matters was not merely a matter of social etiquette. It was the quiet acceptance of their fundamental role as economic instruments in a world dominated by male power and the pursuit of wealth. Her life, her very existence, was bound by the invisible chains of the dowry, a constant reminder that her true worth was a figure on a ledger, not the beating heart within her chest. Number 5. The precariousness of widowhood and dowry recovery. Life in 1060 was brutish and often tragically short. Famines, diseases, and the ever-present threat of localized conflicts, or the looming shadow of foreign invasions, meant that the death of a husband was an unfortunate, but not uncommon, reality for women. When a woman was widowed, her world could shatter, and the very foundation of her existence, often built upon the economic security her husband provided, would tremble. While Anglo-Saxon law, especially for women, was somewhat more progressive than later Norman law, offering some rights, the fate of a woman's dowry, or the assets she had brought into her marriage, became terrifyingly precarious upon her husband's death. The intricate web of customary practices and legal ambiguities surrounding these assets often left her vulnerable, facing an uphill battle to retain what was rightfully hers, or what was promised to her. Consider the mourning gift, a common Anglo-Saxon practice. This was land or property that the groom settled upon his bride on the morning after their wedding. It was intended for her maintenance and was considered her personal property, often passing to her children upon her death. While seemingly beneficial, the reality was often far more complex. This mourning gift, though hers by custom, was frequently managed and utilized by her husband during his lifetime. It was incorporated into the marital estate, its revenues supporting the household, its boundaries perhaps merging with his own lands. When he died, particularly if he died suddenly or without clear arrangements, the task of disentangling her mourning gift from the rest of his estate could be monumental. His male heirs, eager to consolidate their inheritance, might dispute her claim, arguing about the precise boundaries, the true value, or even the very existence of the mourning gift. Without strong male protectors, without meticulously recorded charters or witnesses, a widow could find herself in a legal quagmire, battling her late husband's family for what was promised to her. The future of her children, hinged on her ability to navigate this treacherous landscape, often against powerful and relentless adversaries. Concept of dower, a portion of the husband's land, typically one-third, that was settled on the wife for her sustenance in widowhood, was another vital protection. However, even this, a seemingly ironclad right, was fraught with challenges. The actual assignment of dower could be contentious. The husband's heirs might try to assign the least productive lands, lands far from her home, or lands encumbered by debt. They might delay the assignment, leaving her in a desperate state of limbo, without income or a secure place to live. Imagine a widow, perhaps with young children, standing before her husband's stern-faced brother or ambitious nephew. Her grief was still fresh, her vulnerability palpable. They would present her with a few barren fields, a crumbling hut, or a remote forest patch, claiming it was her rightful dower. To dispute it meant engaging in lengthy, costly, and emotionally draining legal proceedings that a woman, often lacking legal knowledge, resources, or the physical ability to travel, was ill-equipped to handle. The weight of such a burden, at a time of profound emotional distress, was crushing. Even if her dowry or mourning gift was successfully recovered, it was rarely in the same state as it had been when she brought it into the marriage. The husband might have mortgaged the land, sold off parts of it, or neglected its maintenance. If her dowry had been livestock, they might have been slaughtered, sold, or lost to disease. If it was silver, it might have been spent to pay debts, fund military campaigns, or acquire other properties. The concept of recovering the dowry often meant accepting a diminished, depreciated, or entirely different set of assets than what she had initially contributed. She might receive a fraction of the value, or property of inferior quality, leaving her significantly poorer than she had been when she entered the marriage. This left many widows in a state of penury, struggling to maintain a household, feed their children, or simply survive in a harsh and unforgiving world. Furthermore, the legal system itself, though theoretically offering some protection to women, was heavily skewed towards men. The local courts, assemblies of freemen, were dominated by male landowners and presided over by male reeves or shire officials. A woman's testimony, while valid, might be dismissed or undervalued if it contradicted the word of a powerful male kinsman of her late husband. She might face accusations of greed, of attempting to seize more than her rightful share, or even of impropriety. Her reputation, her very standing in the community, could be weaponized against her. She might find herself isolated, with no family to champion her cause, no powerful lord to offer protection, and no resources to pursue justice. The legal battle often became a battle for her very dignity and survival, waged against a system that was not designed to favor her. The precariousness of her position as a widow was further exacerbated by the social expectations of the time. A widow was expected to remain chaste, to uphold her late husband's memory, and to manage her household responsibly. Any perceived deviation from these norms could weaken her claim to her dower or mourning gift. If she was accused of unchastity, of remarriage too quickly, or of squandering her existing resources, her former in-laws could use these accusations to undermine her legal standing and deny her rightful inheritance. She walked a tightrope, her every move scrutinized, her financial future hanging precariously in the balance. Fear of being dispossessed, of having her meager resources stripped away, was a constant, chilling presence in her life. In some cases, the very recovery of her dowry or dower was tied to her remarriage. Some agreements stipulated that her entitlement would cease if she took another husband. While this might seem a clear-cut provision, it placed an immense burden on a widow. If she remarried for security, for companionship, or for the continuation of her family line, she could lose the very assets that were meant to sustain her. This left her with an agonizing choice: remain single and potentially struggle economically, or remarry and relinquish her vital economic base. It was a choice that often left her trapped, her freedom to choose her own future curtailed by the very assets that were meant to empower her. Dowry, once a symbol of her entry into security, became a source of ongoing anxiety, a financial ghost haunting her past and threatening her future, leaving her vulnerable and dependent on the whims of a system that often prioritized male succession and family consolidation over her individual well-being. Number 4, her erasure from economic independence. In the year 1060, the moment a woman pledged her vows and entered into matrimony, a subtle yet profound shift occurred in her economic standing. Anglo-Saxon women, compared to their later Norman counterparts, possessed some remarkable rights. They could own land, engage in trade, and even appear in court. The act of marriage often initiated a process of economic absorption, a gradual erasure of her independent financial identity. Her dowry, that significant gift of land, silver, or goods from her family, while intended to secure her future, paradoxically became the very instrument of her husband's economic dominance, rendering her, in practical terms, less autonomous than she had been as a single woman. Consider the journey of that dowry. Once presented and acknowledged, it largely passed into the husband's control. While it might still be legally recognized as hers in some contexts, especially her mourning gift lands, the management, the utilization, and the direct benefits of these assets invariably fell to him. Imagine a woman who brought with her a productive plot of land, its soil rich for cultivating barley and oats. Before marriage, she might have overseen its tenants, directed its laborers, and personally managed the sale of its harvest. After marriage, however, these responsibilities, and crucially, the income derived from them, would typically be absorbed into the husband's larger estate. He would decide the planting schedules, collect the rents, and direct the sale of the produce. Her prior role as an independent manager was replaced by a more passive position, relegated to overseeing the domestic sphere, while her husband controlled the external, wealth-generating aspects of their shared life. The land was still theoretically hers, perhaps, but its practical control, its economic power, resided firmly in his hands. This transfer of control meant that her personal wealth, once a source of her individual agency, became inextricably linked to her husband's fortunes. If he was a prudent manager, her assets might flourish alongside his. But if he was reckless, extravagant, or simply unlucky, succumbing to gambling, investing poorly, or suffering crop failures, her dowry could be diminished, mortgaged, or even lost entirely, despite her having no direct say in these decisions. Imagine the gnawing anxiety of a wife witnessing her husband's mismanagement, knowing that the very land her father had painstakingly saved for her, the silver that represented her family's legacy, was slowly slipping through his grasp. Please, her advice, her wisdom on managing land might be dismissed, her concerns unheard in a patriarchal society that deemed financial matters the sole purview of the male head of household. She was powerless to intervene, a silent observer to the potential ruin of her own economic foundation. Furthermore, the very act of marriage often consolidated the financial resources of both families. The husband, now possessing his wife's dowry, was not merely managing her assets, he was integrating them into his own economic ventures. This meant that the line between his property and hers became increasingly blurred in everyday practice. The revenues generated from her dowry lands might be used to improve his own estate, to pay off his existing debts, or to fund his own ambitions, such as purchasing additional lands or equipping himself for military service. While these actions might theoretically benefit the collective household, they reinforced her financial dependence. She could no longer make independent economic decisions or pursue her own ventures without his consent. Her signature, if she even possessed the literacy to write one, was often not enough to secure loans, sell property, or enter into contracts without her husband's explicit authorization. Her economic voice, once clear and distinct, became muffled, subsumed by the dominant roar of his financial authority. The implication of this economic absorption extended beyond her dowry. Any wealth she might acquire during the marriage, through her own diligent efforts in managing the household, producing goods, or engaging in small-scale trade, often also fell under his ultimate control. Earnings, whether from brewing ale, spinning wool, or selling surplus produce from the garden, would be folded into the household economy, managed by him, and utilized at his discretion. While she might oversee the daily expenses and allocate resources for domestic needs, the larger financial decisions, the investments, and the significant transactions were his alone. This established a pattern of financial dependency that could be deeply disempowering. Even if she possessed remarkable acumen for business or a keen eye for investment, her talents were confined to the domestic sphere, rarely allowed to flourish in the broader economic landscape where men held sway. This structural economic dependence was not merely a matter of legal decree. It was deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of Anglo-Saxon society in 1060. The ideal of a husband as the provider and protector, and a wife as the mistress of the household, while offering security, inherently limited her scope for economic action. A woman, even one with a substantial dowry, found her public economic role diminished, her private economic role constrained by the overarching authority of her husband. She might influence decisions through persuasion or negotiation within the marital home, but the ultimate power of decision-making, the legal right to bind the family economically, rested with him. The loss of economic independence had profound long-term consequences. It meant that a woman's future security was entirely tied to the longevity and benevolence of her husband. If he died young, or if he proved to be a cruel or neglectful partner, her economic survival depended on the difficult and often contested process of reclaiming her dower, or what remained of her dowry. It meant that her skills in managing large estates, if she had them, were never truly tested in a public arena where she could build her own reputation and fortune. Her life's work, her economic contributions, were often invisible, absorbed into the larger narrative of her husband's achievements. Economic self, once vibrant and potentially powerful, became a ghost within the larger economic entity of her husband's domain, leaving her vulnerable, less autonomous, and ultimately less in control of her own destiny than she might have been before she ever walked down the aisle. Number 3, the loss of her birthright and future claims. In the year 1060, for countless young women, the dowry, that significant transfer of property or wealth accompanying her into marriage, represented not just an offering to her new husband, but also a stark and often final severance from her birth family's main inheritance. It was a common, unwritten rule, deeply ingrained in the customs of Anglo-Saxon society, that a daughter's dowry was considered her pre-mortem inheritance, her one and only share of her paternal estate. Once that land, that silver, or those valuable goods were given over, her claims on her family's remaining ancestral lands or future wealth were largely extinguished. This practice, while ostensibly providing her with a secure start in her new life, effectively cut her off from the patrimony that would continue to benefit her brothers, leaving her permanently reliant on her marital arrangements. Imagine a young woman, perhaps named Elfwin, growing up on a thriving estate, surrounded by the familiar fields and forests that had belonged to her family for generations. She would have seen her brothers, younger and older, being groomed to manage these lands, learning the intricacies of farming, tenant relations, and local governance. Their futures were inextricably linked to the continuation of the family line on that very land. Her own future, however, was different. From a young age, she would have understood that her destiny lay elsewhere, that her place was to be married into another family, to forge new alliances. The land she loved, the home she knew, was not hers to inherit in perpetuity. Instead, a specific portion, carefully designated and meticulously valued, would be set aside as her dowry. This land might be a small parcel, a distant farm, or a number of acres equivalent to a certain value. It was her share, the one and only significant claim she would ever make on her birth family's wealth. This practice of dowry as pre-inheritance served a crucial purpose for the male heirs and the family line. By providing a daughter with her dowry, the family ensured that the core, undivided estate remained intact for the sons. Primogeniture, the system where the eldest son inherits all the land, was not yet universally rigid in Anglo-Saxon England as it would become after the Norman conquest, but the tendency was strong for male heirs to consolidate the main family holdings. Daughters, with their potential for marrying into other families and scattering the inheritance through their children, were seen as a threat to this consolidation. Dowry, therefore, acted as a clean break, a tidy financial transaction that settled her claims and removed her from the future line of inheritance, leaving the path clear for her brothers. It was a practical solution for land-owning families seeking to preserve their power and status across generations, but it came at the direct expense of the daughter's long-term connection to her ancestral wealth. The consequences for the woman were profound. It meant that no matter how successful her marriage, no matter how prosperous her husband became, she could never look back to her birth family for further financial support or expect to inherit any portion of the main estate should her parents die or her brothers pass without heirs. Connection to her ancestral lands, her birthright, was effectively severed. If her marriage failed, if she was widowed without children, or if her husband mismanaged her dowry, she had no automatic recourse to her original family's wealth. She could not return home to claim a share, for her share had already been given. She was an outsider, reliant solely on the dower rights from her deceased husband's estate, which, as discussed earlier, were themselves often precarious. This created a profound sense of isolation and permanent separation from her roots, forcing her to build her entire future on the foundation of her marriage, with no safety net from her original kin. Furthermore, this practice subtly devalued a daughter's contribution to the family's overall prosperity during her youth. While sons were seen as future custodians of the land, daughters, despite their vital roles in the household, in managing servants, processing food, and contributing to the domestic economy, were ultimately viewed as temporary residents, destined to depart with their dowries. Their efforts and contributions were part of the family's present, but not its future continuity on the land. This implicit message could foster a sense of being an expendable member, a necessary investment for a strategic alliance, rather than an integral part of the family's long-term legacy. Dowry, intended as a benefit, ironically marked her exclusion, a gentle but firm push out of the direct line of inheritance and into a future entirely defined by her husband's family. This also meant that a woman's voice in family decisions regarding the ancestral lands or the inheritance of her brothers was likely diminished, if not entirely silenced. Having received her portion, she was considered to have no further vested interest in the main estate. Her advice, her opinions, her emotional connection to the land would carry little weight in the face of her brother's undisputed claims. She was no longer a stakeholder in the ongoing legacy of her birth family's land, only an observer from afar. This exclusion, though financial in its origin, had deep social and emotional ramifications, creating a subtle but undeniable barrier between her and the family she grew up in. She might visit, she might be welcomed, but her legal and economic ties to the ancestral home had been irrevocably loosened, if not entirely severed. The impact of this separation extended across generations. A woman's children, her sons and daughters, would have no claim on her birth family's ancestral lands. Their inheritance would derive solely from their father's lineage. This meant that the connections she brought through her dowry were ultimately fleeting, limited to the immediate benefit of her husband and the establishment of her own household. Children would not look to her maiden family's lineage as a source of future inheritance, only as a source of their mother's origins. This complete transfer of lineage and inheritance through the male line further solidified the patriarchal structures of the time, effectively erasing the daughter's ancestral link once her dowry had been paid, and ensuring that her birth family's primary legacy flowed exclusively through its sons, leaving her branch of the family tree without roots in the ancestral soil. Her dowry, therefore, was not merely a financial transaction. It was a profound act of separation, a closing of the door to her birthright and all future claims on the patrimony that remained with her brothers. Number 2, the crushing financial burden on her family. In the agrarian society of 1060, where land was the ultimate source of wealth and power, the prospect of marrying off a daughter, while a social necessity, could often cast a long, dark shadow over a family's finances. Dowry, whether in the form of land, livestock, precious metals, or valuable goods, was not a mere token. It was a substantial investment, an often crippling financial burden that fell squarely on the shoulders of the bride's family. This expectation, deeply entrenched in social custom, placed immense pressure on families, forcing them to make difficult choices, even sacrificing their own long-term prosperity to ensure their daughter's marriage and perceived security. Imagine a modest landholder, a free farmer with a few hides of land, his livelihood dependent on the fertility of his fields and the health of his small herd of cattle. He has several children, including a daughter approaching marriageable age. The unspoken, yet ever-present, societal pressure dictates that for his daughter to secure a respectable match, a marriage that would enhance, or at least maintain their family's social standing, a dowry of significant value must be prepared. This might mean setting aside a portion of their already limited arable land, a valuable parcel that had contributed directly to the family's annual yield of grain. For a family living close to subsistence, where every acre counted, the act of divesting even a small piece of land for a daughter's dowry could mean the difference between a comfortable harvest and a lean winter, between sufficient food for the family and the gnawing threat of hunger. Preparation of a dowry was a slow, arduous process, often spanning years. It required meticulous saving, shrewd management of resources, and often significant sacrifices. Father might have to forgo necessary improvements to his own fields, delay repairs to his dwelling, or postpone the purchase of new tools. A mother might have to reduce household spending, perhaps by deferring the acquisition of new clothes or by relying more heavily on foraging rather than buying provisions at the market. Every ounce of silver painstakingly accumulated, every young animal carefully bred, every piece of valuable pottery or metalwork crafted was earmarked for the dowry. This constant diversion of resources meant that the family's main estate, their son's future inheritance, might suffer from underinvestment, impacting its long-term productivity and prosperity. Daughter's marriage, while celebrated, often left a gaping hole in the family's immediate finances and cast a long shadow over its future economic growth. The weight of this financial obligation was magnified for families with multiple daughters. Daughter represented a fresh drain on resources, a renewed demand for a substantial dowry. Family with 3 daughters might find themselves in a perpetual state of financial struggle, forever trying to accumulate enough wealth to marry them off respectably. This often led to difficult compromises. Perhaps the dowry for the youngest daughter would be smaller, limiting her marital prospects to a less affluent suitor. Or in extreme cases, a daughter might be sent to a nunnery, not out of religious devotion, but as a practical solution to avoid the insurmountable burden of providing a dowry. While a convent required a contribution, it was generally far less than a full dowry, offering a financially viable alternative for families unable to meet societal expectations. This grim reality meant that a woman's future was often dictated by her family's financial capacity, rather than her own inclinations or spiritual calling. The burden was not just material, it was profoundly psychological. Parents would carry the unspoken worry, the constant anxiety of securing their daughter's future. Failure to provide an adequate dowry could lead to their daughter being left unmarried, or married to a man of significantly lower status, bringing shame not just upon her, but upon the entire family. This societal pressure, the fear of dishonor and diminished standing, often drove families to desperate measures. They might incur significant debts, borrowing from wealthier neighbors or lords, effectively mortgaging their future for the sake of their daughter's present. These debts, often with steep interest rates, could linger for years, further eroding the family's economic stability and placing an additional burden on the sons who would inherit the diminished estate. In some extreme cases, a family might even be forced to sell off parts of their ancestral lands, an act of last resort that was deeply painful and shameful. Part with land that had been in the family for generations, land that represented their heritage and their very identity, was a testament to the immense pressure exerted by the dowry system. This sacrifice made for a daughter's marriage irreversibly reduced the family's long-term wealth, diminished their social standing, and ensured that the legacy they passed on to their sons would be less than what they themselves had inherited. Daughter, acutely aware of the sacrifices made on her behalf, might carry a silent burden of guilt, a feeling of being an immense financial drain on her loved ones. Ultimately, the crushing financial burden of the dowry was a relentless force that shaped the economic landscape of Anglo-Saxon families. Prioritized the transactional nature of marriage over individual financial stability, often ensuring the future security of the daughter's new family at the expense of her birth family's ongoing prosperity. It was a societal expectation that forced families into a cycle of sacrifice, limiting their growth, accumulating debt, and sometimes irrevocably diminishing their ancestral wealth, all to ensure that their daughters were acceptably bought into their new marital homes. This fundamental disadvantage meant that a woman's very entry into society as a married person often came at the price of significant financial hardship for those who loved her most. Number 1, the burden of social stigma and diminished status. In the intricate and often unforgiving social hierarchy of 1060, where every individual occupied a specific rung on the ladder of status and every family sought to maintain or elevate its position, the absence or inadequacy of a dowry could inflict a profound and lasting social stigma upon a woman. It was a mark of perceived failure, a glaring indicator of a family's diminished wealth or influence, and it irrevocably shaped a woman's marital prospects, her standing within her new family, and her very self-perception. In a world where honor and reputation were paramount, a woman with a meager dowry was often relegated to a subordinate position, her worth questioned, and her future shadowed by the harsh judgments of society. Imagine a young woman, perhaps named Edith, who came from a once prosperous family whose fortunes had dwindled due to bad harvests, political upheavals, or a series of unfortunate deaths. Despite her gentle nature, her skills in household management, and her pleasant demeanor, The grim reality of her family's depleted coffers meant that the dowry they could offer was woefully small, perhaps a few pieces of silver and a single ox, rather than the expected parcel of fertile land or a respectable herd of cattle. As word spread among potential suitors and their families, her name would be quietly, or sometimes not so quietly, removed from consideration for desirable matches. The most eligible bachelors, those with lands and lineage, would seek brides who could bring substantial wealth to their unions, women whose dowries would enhance their own estates and solidify their positions. Edith, through no fault of her own, became less desirable, her intrinsic qualities overshadowed by the cold, hard numbers of her economic offering. This diminished financial standing translated directly into a reduced pool of potential husbands. Instead of marrying into a family of equal or higher status, she might be forced to accept a suitor from a lower social stratum, a poorer farmer, a landless freeman, or even a tradesman with no ancestral lands. This marriage, while perhaps providing basic security, would forever mark her as a woman who married down. Her social standing, and by extension, that of her future children, would be irrevocably lower. The family she married into might subtly, or overtly, remind her of her meager contribution, viewing her as a burden rather than an asset. Her voice at family gatherings might carry less weight, her opinions less respected, simply because she had not brought the expected wealth to the marriage. She would constantly be aware of her perceived inferiority, a silent acknowledgement of her family's financial struggles. The stigma extended beyond her immediate marriage. It affected her position within her new marital household. A wife who brought a significant dowry often commanded a certain degree of respect and influence within her husband's family. Contribution was a clear testament to her family's power and a valuable addition to her new household's wealth. She might be given greater authority in managing the household, or her counsel might be sought on important matters. Conversely, a woman with a small or non-existent dowry might be treated more like a dependent, a guest whose presence was tolerated but whose opinions held little sway. She might be subjected to subtle slights, whispers behind her back, or even outright disdain from her in-laws, who might view her as an unnecessary drain on their resources or a source of social embarrassment. Her lack of a substantial dowry could become a constant source of friction, undermining her self-worth and her authority within her own home. Furthermore, the social judgment was not confined to her immediate circle. Gossip and reputation were powerful forces in 1060. The village elders, the local reeve, the other landholders all would be aware of who married whom and with what dowry. A woman who married without a proper dowry might be spoken of with pity, or worse, with thinly veiled contempt. Her situation might be cited as an example of a family's decline, or of a woman's inability to secure a proper match. This public perception could lead to social isolation, as other women, eager to protect their own standing, might distance themselves from her. She might find herself excluded from gatherings, her children overlooked, and her family's name quietly tarnished by the stain of inadequate financial provision. The shame was pervasive, coloring every aspect of her social interaction and reinforcing her diminished status. This burden of social stigma had profound psychological consequences. A woman might internalize the societal judgment, believing herself to be inherently less worthy, less valuable than her peers who had entered marriage with substantial dowries. This could lead to a pervasive sense of inadequacy, a quiet resentment, or a reluctance to assert herself. She might feel a constant need to prove her worth through tireless labor, unwavering obedience, or exceptional skill in domestic duties, striving to compensate for her perceived financial shortfall. The knowledge that her very presence, her very marriage, was viewed as a financial compromise could be a heavy weight, diminishing her spirit and curbing her ambitions. In essence, the dowry was not merely a financial transaction. It was a social barometer, a public declaration of a woman's and her family's standing. Failure to meet the unwritten dowry expectations meant facing a life shadowed by social stigma, diminished respect, and restricted opportunities. Stripped her of her dignity, confined her choices, and often ensured that, regardless of her personal qualities, her place in society would forever be defined by the inadequacy of her initial financial offering, leaving her an enduring prisoner of custom and expectation.